The year was 1881, and the Texas heat clung to the air like old sorrow. Dust hung over the market town as if the sun had baked it in place. Wagons rattled past sun-bleached storefronts, rain slapped leather, and men haggled in rough voices. Half whiskey breath, half desperation. It was the last livestock auction before winter. Folks lingered either to barter for a bargain or to gawk at someone else's misfortune. Silas Carrion stood just beyond the corral, quiet as a shadow. 35, broad-shouldered, coat dusted from the long ride in. Most folks knew him only as the rancher who kept to himself out on the open prairie. He wasn't much for talking, and if he came to town at all, it was to buy a good workhorse and leave before anyone asked questions. Today, he'd returned for a bay mare he'd seen earlier. The animal had ribs showing through its hide, yet her eye still held a stubborn spark. Silas was considering whether she'd survive winter when something else caught his attention. Behind the corral stood a girl, barefoot, thin as willow bark, no older than 19. Her hair fell in tangled waves over her face. Her dress hung torn at the hem, smeared with dirt and something darker. She stood still, not shrinking, not trying to flee, just watching the world from somewhere far away. Beside her was a drunk with a bottle in his fist and a rope in the other. That rope was tied not to a colt, but to her wrist. "Got me a dumb one," he slurred loudly, as though bragging. "Can't talk, can't hear, but she does what she's told. Cheap." A few men snorted into their coats. One spit tobacco at the ground like it was entertainment. Silas looked away. He didn't want to get involved. He came for a horse, nothing more. But before he could step away, the girl lifted her eyes. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't afraid. She just looked directly at him. A steady, wordless look, as if she understood him before he ever decided anything at all, as if she knew he would walk away, or knew he might not. The drunk swayed toward Silas. "Horse comes with the girl. I ain't talking her home. Not even worth the spit it'd take to sell her again." Silas hesitated. The mare pawed anxiously at the dirt. The girl stayed still. That same quiet focus locked on him. Something in that silence held him in place. He'd lived with quiet his whole life, but hers felt different. Intentional. "I'll take both," Silas said. The crowd erupted in rowdy laughter. "Buyin' livestock or startin' a school, Silas?" Someone hollered. He didn't answer. He counted out his coins, more than the mare deserved, far less than any human life should ever cost. The man shoved the rope toward him, but the girl stepped back, drifting behind Silas like she already belonged there. "She's yours now," the drunk barked. "Don't say I didn't warn you. She's dead weight. No talk, no hear. Good luck." Silas tossed the rope aside. He didn't like the feel of it in his hands. He led the trembling mare toward his wagon. The girl followed without being told, clutching only a thin shawl around her shoulders. Not a word, not a sound at the wagon. She waited for him to gesture, then climbed in. She folded into the corner like she'd practiced disappearing her whole life. Silas climbed into the seat and snapped the reins. Before the wheels turned, he felt something tug lightly at his coat. He glanced back. The girl's fingers brushed against the fabric, just once, then fell away. Not a request. Not gratitude. More like she needed him to know she was there. He looked at her small, staring toward the horizon, as if she was already trying to read the land the way others read voices. Then he drove onward. Neither of them looked back at the town they'd left behind. The wagon creaked across the dusty road into the open Texas evening. He owned 200 acres of stubborn red clay, a leaning house, a few barns, and cattle that didn't complain half as much as people. It had always been enough for him. Quiet, lonely, hard, But tonight, as the sun dipped low and the land settled, under a bruised sky, he led a half-starved Moray into his pasture, and a girl who had never said a single word into his home. When they entered the kitchen, he lit the fire and pointed to the kettle. She moved without hesitation, finding the cups, as though she had worked around hearths her whole life. Not one sound passed her lips. Later, he placed a piece of chalk in her hand and tapped the wooden doorframe. "Name," he said. She wrote it carefully, each stroke deliberate. Emiline. Silas whispered it twice, letting it settle in the air. Emiline. She left without waiting for a reaction and walked into the barn. And for reasons he did not yet understand, Silas felt the ranch wasn't so silent anymore. Before dawn, Silas stepped out to the barn to check on the Moray. The cold air cut through his shirt sleeves, and his breath fogged as he entered the dim stable. He was ready to see the animal struggling again, but instead he found Emiline kneeling beside the bay mare. She moved slow, her hands steady, smoothing a damp cloth down the horse's flank. The Moray wasn't fighting her. Instead, she leaned into Emiline's touch like she'd been waiting for it. The girl worked with a strange patience, feeling the leg, pressing gently, cleaning the wound as though she heard the animal's pain through her fingers. Silas leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He had watched plenty of ranch hands get kicked bloody for less. But this half-starved horse was calm, breathing slow, trusting her. He didn't say a word, and she didn't look up to check whether he was watching. She didn't need to. By midday, he gave her chores, not because he expected gratitude, but because he wanted to understand what she was capable of. He pointed to the tack room. She cleaned it without being told where anything went. He motioned toward the floorboards. She scrubbed them so clean, the wood looked polished. And she never asked for instructions twice. Not in speech, not in signs, just understanding. Every evening, he left a piece of chalk by the table. She wrote only single words or short notes, but the things she wrote made him pause. Wind heavy, bacon low, dog limping. Simple, but always right. Accurate in ways that felt closer to awareness than guessing. For a man who had lived years without real conversation, the silence in his home shifted from empty to observant. Then came the storm. It started in the strange way Texas storms always did, quietly. A warm gust late in the afternoon, the sky bright but uneasy. Silas noticed the horizon darken, but he thought it nothing unusual. He was busy checking on a sick calf, hand on its hide, when a blur of movement came through the barn. Door, Emiline, barefoot, hair wild, breath quick, but she made no sound. She grabbed his sleeve and pulled hard enough to startle him. "What?" He muttered. Her eyes darted upward, then back to him. No words, no chalk, no sign. But the intensity in her look was sharper than any warning whistle. She pulled him again toward the outside, away from the cattle shed. Lightning hadn't struck yet. There was no thunder rolling across the sky, not even the smell of rain. But she already knew. He opened his mouth to question her again, but then it happened. A white blast split the sky open. Lightning struck the old cottonwood tree behind it, shed so violently it sounded like the earth cracked apart. Fire tore through its trunk, branches exploding, sparks showering the dirt. The ground shuddered beneath them like a wounded animal. Cattle bawled. Smoke curled upward. Silas stumbled back, heart pounding. She had known before any hint of danger. Not guessed, known. For a long moment, neither moved. Then they acted on instinct, hauling buckets, dousing sparks, calming frantic animals until the flames died down to smoking embers. By the time they collapsed inside the house, the wind was howling through the fields. Emiline sat at the table, her hands still trembling from exertion. Silas poured water for them both, though she didn't drink. She stared into the flames of the hearth, her face lit in flickering orange. He sat across from her, unsure of what to ask, unsure whether to ask at all. Finally he spoke, voice low, barely louder than the quiet between them. "How did you—" "No?" She looked up, meeting his gaze with that same silent certainty. She didn't look confused. She didn't look proud. She just looked sure. She turned, her palms upward, opening them slightly, as though she was offering an answer she couldn't put into words. Then she closed her fingers slowly, letting the explanation settle between them. She heard something beyond sound. Silas didn't speak. Again, the storm outside raged like the sky was tearing itself apart. But inside that cabin, she sat still, and he watched her. And in the hush of burning embers and distant thunder, Silas finally recognized something aching and unfamiliar. He wasn't alone, not because someone talked to him, but because someone understood. When the fire settled low, he whispered her name again, not to see if she'd respond, but because the sound of it now felt different. Emiline. Her eyes lifted briefly, answering without voice. It was enough. The world after the storm felt different, as if the wind carried new questions. Silas moved through his chores quietly the next morning, half watching Emiline from the corner of his eye. He wasn't suspicious. He was curious in a way he hadn't been curious about anyone in years. She worked without hesitation, tending to the injured Mare first, then the chickens, then the kettle, as though she already knew the order he would have chosen. She didn't wait for instructions. She didn't check for approval. She just knew what needed doing. Around mid-morning, Silas noticed the head cow standing apart from the herd, her nose low, eyes dull. He frowned, chalking it up to cold weather or an upset stomach. But before he could fetch a bucket of feed to tempt her, Emiline was already pulling straw into the birthing stall. Silas stopped mid-step. "That cow isn't birthing," he told her, though he wasn't sure why he bothered speaking when she never reacted to his words. Emiline didn't look at him. She fetched warm water, a handful of mint, and sprinkled the steam near the cow's muzzle. Her fingers settled quietly against the animal's belly, and she waited still, patient, certain. By sundown, the cow was in labor. Silas caught himself staring at Emiline long after the calf was born, trying to decide whether what she had was instinct luck or something deeper. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't signed a single word. Yet she knew things before they happened, and never once did she look surprised when she was right. That night, sleep didn't come easy for him. Not because of fear, but because he kept replaying what she had seen that he hadn't. The storm, the horse's pain, the labor. He lay awake, listening to the wind scrape along the eaves, as if the world outside was trying to whisper something he couldn't yet understand. The next day, Silas rode into town. He had business with the sheriff. Land disputes. Old claims stirred up again like an unwelcome ghost. Rumors about how Silas's father had acquired part of the ranch during the war lingered, sticky as tar. Words like stolen land and wrongfully taken floated through town, though no one offered proof. It wasn't a new burden, but each time it returned, the guilt latched deeper into his ribs. He didn't tell Emiline about the meeting. Didn't want to. Didn't see why he should. But when he came home at dusk, shoulders tight with memory and resentment, she stepped outside before he'd even tied off his horse. She didn't ask anything. She didn't touch him right away. She just looked at him, eyes steady and patient, like she was listening to something inside him. Silas sat on the porch steps, hands gripped between his knees. He stared across the property, his father's grave a dark shape beneath the oak. He never spoke about that grave, not to anyone. Then, without a word, Emiline came to him and rested her hand lightly on his shoulder, gentle, steady, with a warmth that felt older than speech. It wasn't comfort, not exactly. It was recognition. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest loosening just enough for him to speak the thoughts he never intended to say aloud. "I know how folks see this place," he murmured. "How they see me. They think my father took what wasn't his. Maybe he did. Maybe I'm living on land that never belonged to us." He didn't expect her to react. She couldn't hear him. Yet as he spoke, she turned her hand, placing it over his chest, right over his heart. Slow, deliberate. Then she walked toward the oak tree, the place where the old grave lay, and stopped there, hands folded before her, as if she were looking at something only she could see. Silas stayed on the porch, breathing hard, the kind of breath that came after holding pain too long. He hadn't mentioned the grave. He hadn't pointed it out. He had never once spoken about guilt aloud in front of her, yet she knew. That night he dreamt of cannon smoke and shouted commands, a land taken in exchange for blood, of his father's voice telling him he must carry the weight of both. Silas woke gasping, sweat clinging to his shirt. For a moment he panicked, thinking he was still alone in the nightmare. But then he saw her. Emiline sat near the hearth, a single candle burning beside her. In the flicker of its light lay a blue handkerchief trimmed with lace his mother's. Silas had not seen it in years. It had been locked away where no one else had touched it. He whispered, barely audible, "How did you find that?" Emiline didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her stillness was an answer. She heard pain the way others heard thunder, and for the first time, a chill of fear ran through Silas. Not fear of her, but fear of what it would mean to lose someone who understood him without a single word. By morning, the flame of that lone candle felt burned into Silas's memory. Not the candle itself, but the way Emiline had sat beside it, keeping watch as though she'd been listening to something he couldn't hear even in his sleep, as though she'd known his dreams were heavy before he ever stirred. He went about the day quieter than usual, not because he feared her, but because he feared how much she seemed to know without being told. In town, whispers moved like brush fire. People noticed things. People always did. And where curiosity grew, so did suspicion. The blacksmith's wife muttered to her neighbor, "She stares too long at animals," while wrapping cloth around warm bread. A ranch hand claimed she pointed at his sick goat 2 days before it died. Soon the tale twisted. She touched the goat and cursed it. No one had ever heard Emiline speak. And because she gave the world no words, the world made up its own. When Silas and Emiline walked through town together to buy grain, the conversations around them slowed, then stopped. A woman pulled her child behind her skirt. Men who once joked with Silas now stepped back, eyes flicking from him to her like she carried a rattlesnake in her shawl. Emiline kept her chin low, but Silas saw the way her hands tightened around the basket she carried, how her shoulders drew in, as if she were trying to shrink away from their eyes. He didn't confront anyone, not then. He bought what he needed, and they left. But the silence in town wasn't like the quiet of his ranch. It was a silence heavy with fear. That silence followed them home. Days later, when a rancher's boy came down with a fever, so harsh his skin turned crimson, and he shook through the night. It wasn't the doctor who arrived. It was Emiline. She went into the barn where the child lay as if summoned by the sickness itself. She didn't ask permission. She simply knelt beside him, touched his chest, his forehead, and closed her eyes. Silas watched from the doorway, muscles tense. And yet something in her stillness calmed him. She left the barn, walked outside, and began gathering herbs, lavender, feverfew, and a wild leaf Silas barely recognized. She boiled them, made a steeped cloth, and pressed it against the boy's brow. She stayed beside him until dawn by sunrise. The boy's fever had broken. His mother sobbed with gratitude and kissed Emiline's hands. But gratitude rarely lasts long in the face of fear. By midday, the same mother whispered at the well. How did she know? Not gratitude anymore. Suspicion. That fear gathered like storm clouds. And 3 days later, a group of townsfolk came walking down the road to Silas's ranch, not with torches lit, but carried like threats. 8 of them, boots grinding the dirt, led by Mr. Withers, who had his hat pulled low and jaw clenched tight. "We want her gone," Withers said, voice brittle with anger. "That girl hears things she ought not." Silas stood in the barn doorway, arms folded, shoulders wide as a gatepost. His jaw tightened. "She's mute," he said plainly. Withers snapped back like dry wood breaking. "Mute don't mean deaf. She sees storms before thunder, knows births before they come. Animals obey her like she's whispering to 'em. You think that's normal?" A murmur rose. They weren't there to debate. They were there to eliminate what scared them. Inside the house, Emiline stood behind the curtain, watching their faces full of certainty, not hate. She stepped forward, but Silas put out his hand, stopping her. He stepped toward the crowd, boots sinking slightly in thawing mud. No yelling. No guns. Just a firm voice that shook like thunder because it didn't need to be loud. "She saved a boy's life," Silas said. "Maybe she gave him the sickness," a woman spat back. Silas didn't flinch. "You don't listen to her, but she listens. To everything, not with ears, with her hands, with her breath, with whatever part of her hears this world better than any of us." He let his voice deepen, steady. "I've lived 35 years on this land, and I can count on one hand the people who've ever actually heard me." She did, without a word spoken. No one moved. "You push her out because you fear what you don't understand," he continued. "But if anyone tries to drag her off this land, they'll be dragging me too." The wind blew harder, tugging at coats and hats. Withers opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. One by one, they turned back, porches unused, boots heavy. Silas stood there until they disappeared over the ridge. That evening, Emiline placed warm cider on the table. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out slowly, rested her fingers on his hand, and left them there. Gratitude got recognition. The 2 people who heard without ever speaking. The first snowfall of winter arrived slow, as if it didn't want to disturb anything on Silas's land. Snow gathered along fences, laying soft against the roof, like a blanket, tucking the ranch into quiet rest. The air turned crisp and smoke. From the hearth drifted up in thin blue threads. Inside the kitchen, Emiline sat by the window, working a needle through scraps of cloth and leather. She pieced together a cloak sturdy, warm, stitched from bits of worn jackets and wool cuffs, even the lining of an old coat Silas hadn't worn in years. She worked with the methodical grace of someone who didn't need words to understand purpose. Silas watched her from the doorway. She didn't look up, but she moved like she could feel his presence, the same way she sensed a storm or an animal's pain. He no longer questioned it. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles before the frost thickened. She brushed horses in gentle circles that calmed even the most skittish yearlings. She brewed coffee before dawn, each gesture quiet but certain. Life didn't just continue with her around it, took on rhythm. The ranch didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt listened to. One afternoon, Silas rode out to mend the broken fence near the ridge. The light was thinning, clouds casting a dull gray over the land. As he tightened a wire post, his horse spooked at a sudden noise, a crack or shifting. Stone and reared. Silas hit the frozen ground hard, slamming shoulder first into a jagged root. The breath wrenched from his lungs. His ribs throbbed, elbow bleeding through his sleeve. Gritting his teeth, he stumbled toward home, each step pounding pain through his side. By the time he reached the yard, night had swallowed the sky. He didn't knock. He didn't call out, but Emiline burst from the cabin as if she'd been waiting for him. No lantern held, no warning. She didn't hesitate, didn't question. She grabbed his good arm and pulled him inside with surprising strength. She sat him by the fire, unwrapped his makeshift cloth bandage, and examined the wound. Her brows tightened not fear, just concentration. She cleaned the cut, brought hot water and herbs, pressing a paste of yarrow and pine against his skin. Silas winced, but she worked with a steady rhythm, fingers careful, breath slow. Her hands were warm, the kind of warmth that eased pain more than medicine did. "You always know," he whispered, half-dazed. Emiline paused, meeting his eyes. Then, without warning, she lifted his injured hand, gently turned it, held it like it was fragile as a newborn thing, and brought it to her face. Her lips brushed the edge of the wound in a soft, wordless gesture. Silas froze. It wasn't a kiss of romance. It was something older, deeper, like a healer sealing hurt with care, like acknowledging pain instead of ignoring it. The firelight made shadows stretch across her face, and for a moment he saw not a girl who was cast aside for silence, but a woman who had chosen quiet as her language. Later, as the storm outside rattled the windows, Silas sat at the table while she washed, the herbs from her hands. His thoughts wouldn't settle. He rose, found a sheet of paper and a pencil in the drawer, and wrote slowly words he had never dared to say aloud. When he turned the paper toward her, the letters were plain, but heavy with meaning. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." Emiline read it without touching it at first. Her eyes traced every curve of every letter, as if understanding needed time to bloom inside her. Then, with the gentlest touch, she ran her fingertips over the words, as though she could feel truth inside the ink. Her eyes lifted, full of a warmth he didn't need language to recognize. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his heart only once, a soft, careful press dot, and then she smiled. Not a smile forced by gratitude or fear. Not a small, polite expression, but something alive, like dawn spilling over snow, like the world thawing after a long freeze. Outside, wind howled through the eaves. But inside, Silas felt a quiet warmer than fire spread through him. Silence had never spoken so loudly, and it was enough. Winter tightened its grip on the ranch, but life settled into a steady rhythm, two people moving through the same world without ever needing to break the quiet between them. The snow softened the ground. Animals huddled closer to heat, and inside Silas's home, something warmer than fire began to take root. Emiline taught him sign language in small pieces. She didn't overwhelm him with phrases or rush through gestures. She started with simple things: water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like they belonged to the wind fluid, confident. Silas fumbled more than once, and she never laughed, never mocked him. Instead, she guided his hands gently, her touch careful, patient, like she was teaching him how to listen without ears. He taught her to ride. She'd never sat a saddle before, and the first time he showed her how to mount, her knuckles turned, white from gripping too hard. Silas walked beside her as the horse took slow steps, talking low, even though she couldn't hear. She didn't need his voice. She matched the horse's rhythm through instinct alone, through the same quiet awareness that had startled him since the moment he met her. Evenings belonged to both of them. They built a tiny room off the cabin half-shelter, half-sanctuary, where they cooked together and ate in comfortable silence. She used herbs without explanation, and his meals tasted richer. He chopped wood without being asked, and she made blankets thick enough to hold in the heat. They didn't trade words. They traded attention. In the stable, Silas saw it again now. Animals responded to her. A colt that wouldn't take a halter from him lifted its head for her without hesitation. A stubborn mule relaxed beneath her palm. She never forced anything. She simply waited, extending her hand, and eventually they came to her. The longer Silas watched, the more he understood. Emiline didn't command the world. She listened to it. One night, after patching a fence in biting cold, Silas sat heavily. By the hearth, the heat on his skin felt almost too good. Emiline knelt beside him, brushing snow from his coat sleeve. He signed clumsily, "You make this place full." Her eyes widened, not with surprise, but with something warm and soft. She reached out and touched his mouth, lightly, not to hush him, but to show she understood. A thank you without formality, a quiet reply that said, "I hear you too." Then came the night without warning. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire, exhaustion dragging him under before he could remove his boots. The lantern flickered low. Outside, the night looked calm, no wind howling through trees, no thunder building on the horizon. But Emiline woke him with a touch to his shoulder, sudden and sharp. He jolted upright, startled. She didn't sign a word. She grabbed his coat and pulled toward the door. Her urgency was unmistakable. Outside, the air felt wrong-charged, restless. In the barn, the horses stomped and snorted, eyes wild. Emiline moved through them like she was part of the wind itself. Her hands skimmed their flanks, calming them, guiding them toward the smaller shelter near the house. Silas shouted, though he knew she wouldn't hear, "Roof will hold. We've got time." Emiline signed fast, sharp gestures. Roof. Fall. Now. They moved every horse they could, pushing through panic, struggling against heavy hooves and fear. The last mare cleared the doorway just as a deep crack split the barn. Roof. A beam crashed down where Silas had stood moments before, crushing the stall, splinters flying like shrapnel. Silas stumbled backward, heart pounding. Emiline stood in the doorway, face wet with snow, hair clinging to her cheeks. She wasn't afraid. She looked steady, rooted, like she belonged to this land in a way he'd never understood before. "How did you know?" He whispered, breath fogging the cold. She touched her chest, then pointed to the sky, to the earth, to everything. Feel. Later, inside the cabin, he wrapped a blanket around her frost-chilled shoulders. She didn't shiver. She simply watched him, eyes bright with something unspoken. Silas took her hand, signing slowly, "You belong to this land." She placed his hand over her heart. He felt her rhythm quiet, steady, certain. She never needed sound. Finally, Silas understood. She wasn't hearing less than the world. She was hearing more. The winter sun lingered low on the horizon, never fully rising, never fully leaving. Word about Emiline began to travel beyond the ranch past from one household to another, softened through cold breaths and kitchen hearths. People who once crossed the road to avoid her now lingered at the idea of what she might offer. Not loudly, not boldly, but curiosity crept in quietly, as most change does. The first to come was Tom Weaver, a gruff ranch hand with a torn shoulder and pride too, stubborn to ask for help outright. He rode up early one gray morning, reins in one hand, the other arm limp at his side. Silas spotted him from the porch. "What brings you limping out here, Tom?" Silas asked. Tom nodded his chin toward the garden where Emiline was kneeling. "Heard she fixes things quiet." Silas gave a slow nod. "She does." Emiline came forward without being called. Tom tried to speak, tried to explain, but she didn't wait for the words. She looked at him, studied his shoulder, and laid her hands gently on the joint. He winced at first, then breathed out, the tension easing under her fingers. She moved the arm a little, testing, as though she could feel the injury rather than diagnose it. Tom left with his shoulder wrapped tight. Pain eased, and without a single question asked. 2 days later, a widow arrived, cheeks hollow, eyes exhausted. "Haven't slept in weeks," she murmured to Silas. Emiline brushed past the explanation, guiding the woman into the house. She sat with her till dusk, hands resting lightly on her shoulders, the widow's breathing slow, turning peaceful. The next morning she returned with a pie and a knitted scarf. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." Slowly, cautiously, people began leaving gifts at the gate preserves, wool socks, even a set of warm gloves. No apologies, no confessions of fear, just offerings of quiet respect. Most mornings, Emiline wrote on the small slate, hanging beside the door short messages, as succinct as she was. "Today will be good. I feel it." She wasn't always right. But when she was, the town noticed. And they believed a little more each time. Then came the Sunday that would settle the last of their doubts. The church bell had barely finished ringing when panic stormed through the streets. A 7-year-old boy had gone missing during morning. Chores. One small boot was found near the tree line. Nothing else. Men hollered. Women cried. Dogs barked and pulled at leashes. The forest swallowed sound. Fear took root quickly. Silas grabbed his coat, prepared to join the search. But before he could step off the porch, Emiline touched his arm, then knelt. She pressed her palms to the earth, slow, deliberate. Her eyes closed, face lifted slightly. Not listening to voices, but listening still. She crawled forward an inch, felt the ground again, then another inch. No words. No haste. People stared as if she had lost her mind. But Silas moved with her, trusting something he could never quite. Named out, she stood abruptly, pointed west. Silas followed without asking why. Tom Weaver joined next, then others. Uncertain, but not willing to stand still while time passed. Emiline walked at a steady pace, pausing only to study tiny clues that seemed invisible to everyone else. A shifted pebble, a snapped twig. Tracks. So faint even the dogs missed them. She never hesitated, never changed direction. After what felt like hours, they reached a ring of cedar trees. Beneath one low branch lay the boy, curled tightly, ankles swollen, face streaked with dirt and fear. The searchers froze shock first, then relief crashing over them all. Emiline rushed forward, kneeling by his side. She checked his leg, touched his forehead gently, and brushed hair from his eyes. The child clung to her shirt, without a sound. No one spoke on the walk back. They didn't need to. When the boy was returned to his family, and stories began to fly faster than the wind could carry, not a single person called her strange anymore. They called her the girl who hears with her heart. The name stuck like warmth to winter air. And the land itself seemed to breathe easier. At sunset, Silas stood by the gate, watching snow turn gold in fading light. Emiline stood beside him, hands tucked into her shawl, eyes soft on the sky. Silas didn't speak. He only felt how the world, once deaf to her, now listened. And how he had been listening to her long before anyone else ever dared to try. Years drifted across the ranch, like seasons rolling through tall grass, quiet, steady, remembered only by the way the earth changed underfoot. The pasture thickened each spring. Wheat bowed heavy beneath summer sun, and the first frost arrived earlier with every passing winter. Silas walked a little slower, and silver strands appeared among Emiline's dark hair, though neither ever mentioned age. They didn't count years the way most folks did. They measured time in smaller things, in the way the barn doors creaked after rain, in the scent of herbs drying by the hearth, in the quiet peace that came before morning chores, Children from the town began to visit often. Some came out of curiosity. Some came for comfort. Many arrived without knowing what they were looking for. Only that something on this ranch felt kinder than the world outside it. Emiline never gave orders, never lectured, never treated any child like they were fragile or foolish. She taught them with silence and patience, letting them discover answers rather than handing them out. In the garden, she showed them how fear and shyness were not the same pointing to the twitching nose of a rabbit that bolted only when it was startled, not when it was simply unsure. In the stable, she showed them how a horse could be calmed, with a single steady hand, not force. They learned to observe, not assume. They learned to listen without sound. Silas built a wooden bench beneath the old cottonwood tree behind the house. Weather smoothed its edges over time, but it stood sturdy, just like the two who sat on it. Every evening they rested side by side, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Silas poured 2 mugs of tea, never too hot, never too sweet, and Emiline would take it with a small nod, her thumb tracing slow circles across the back of his hand. Sometimes he brought out his harmonica and played a tune with no name. She would close her eyes, not to hear the notes, but to feel the rhythm in the evening breeze. Silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, full of the kind of understanding. People search for their whole lives and rarely find out. There came one evening when twilight painted the sky in deep amber. Emiline set down her needlework and turned to Silas, her expression focused and unhurried. Over the years, she had learned to speak a little, not much, just enough to read lips, shape thoughts aloud, and give form to feelings that could not be expressed through hands alone. She still preferred silence, but that night she chose words. Her voice was soft as snow falling on cottonwood branches. "I do not need sound," she whispered slowly, carefully. "Only you." Silas blinked, his throat tightening. He wasn't a man who cried, but he had learned long ago that understanding could break open even the hardest parts of him. He nodded, voice thick but steady. "I hear you," he said. "Always have." They stayed beneath the fading light, neither speaking again. They didn't need to. Something had been spoken that lived beyond words. The next morning, a new group of children arrived, eager footprints crunching across snow. Emiline greeted them silently, smiling as one of the younger. Boys shyly offered her a braid of pine needles tied with thin twine. Instead of speaking, she simply held it close to her chest. He understood. Before the children entered the garden, Emiline took a piece of chalk and wrote on the slate nailed beside the door. She wrote something every morning, a habit now as familiar as sunrise. That day, the words were simple. "They will be kind. I feel it." No one asked how she knew anymore. They just believed she did. When older townsfolk gathered in the store to talk about her, they no longer whispered witch or strange or curse. They called her what she had always been, the one who listens with her heart. Some still shook their heads in skepticism, but most smiled with softened eyes, leaving sweet preserves by. Silas's gate, or dropping off sewing scraps, she could turn into something useful. Another winter came with heavy snow. A boy got lost crossing a field too far from home. Emiline knelt outside the barn, hands pressed to the earth, head bowed. She tilted her face toward the wind, then stood, pointed west, and walked. Silas followed. They found the child curled beneath a fallen branch, frightened but alive. No one questioned her again. Months later, as the world thawed into spring, Silas and Emiline walked together across the pasture. Calves grazed beneath a sky brushed in lilac and honey. They stopped at the top of a hill. Emiline looked out over the land, then laughed a small sound, airy and warm, like breath slipping free. Silas smiled, leaned down, and kissed her temple. No storyteller came to record what happened between them. Their love did not need to be told under lantern light or written into dusty books. It simply lived quiet, constant, real, because sometimes the truest love isn't one shouted from rooftops or spoken loudly to be proven. It's the kind that walks beside you every day, touches your heart without noise, and asks for nothing except to be felt. And in the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak the same language, a lonely rancher and a girl, the world once called deaf, found something deeper than sound could ever hold. A way of listening, it was love itself.